I've been a volunteer firefighter in Sutter Creek, Oklahoma for 11 years. In that time, I've pulled people out of burning houses, worked rollover crashes on county roads, seen things most people never should. I honestly thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. Turns out, I was wrong. And the thing that finally got to me wasn't a fire. It was a guy named Dale. He showed up about 8 months ago, said he'd just moved from Tulsa, told everyone he was EMT certified and wanted to give something back to the community. Captain Briggs couldn't have been happier. We're a small volunteer station. Finding people with medical training out here isn't exactly easy. So Dale filled out the paperwork, shook everybody's hand, and within a couple of weeks, he was part of the rotation, like he'd always been there. The strange part is, everybody liked him, including me. He had an easy smile, always brought food to the station, remembered everybody's kids' names, the kind of guy who made the place feel more like a family just by showing up. Looking back, I think that's exactly why nobody questioned him. The first thing that caught my attention happened about 6 weeks later. Nothing major, just a pattern. Whenever we got a structure fire or a grass fire, Dale never worked the fireside. He always stayed back on medical standby. At first, it made sense. Everybody has their strengths. Some guys are better with hoses, some are better with patients. No big deal. But after a while, I realized it wasn't just most calls. It was every call, without exception. Even when there wasn't a single patient, even when we were short-handed on the fire line, even when we could have really used another set of hands. Somehow, Dale always found a reason to stay with the truck. At the time, I thought he was just playing to his strengths. I didn't realize he was making sure he was never the one walking into a burning building. I noticed it, then I pushed it out of my mind. Everybody has different habits on a fire scene, different routines. After enough years, you stop judging every little thing. So I filed it away and kept going. The second thing was even smaller. We got dispatched for a wellness check out on Route 9. Elderly man. Neighbor hadn't seen him all day, thought something was wrong. When we got there, the man was awake, confused, probably low blood sugar, nothing unusual, the kind of call we handled all the time. Dale dropped down beside him first, and I remember watching him for just a second. Something looked off. It wasn't anything obvious. It was the way he positioned himself. He was angled away from the patient instead of toward him. His hands were moving, but not quite the way they should have been. The whole thing lasted maybe a few seconds, then it was over. The man stabilized, we loaded him into the ambulance, and that was that. On the drive back, I kept replaying it in my head, trying to figure out what had bothered me. I couldn't, so eventually, I let it go. The call that changed everything came late one Tuesday in October. 2-car crash, Miller Road, no streetlights, both vehicles off the pavement. The first car had one driver, a woman, probably around 60. She was breathing, but completely unconscious when we got there. Dale was at her side almost immediately. I was working the other vehicle, but every few seconds I found myself looking back in his direction. Something wasn't right. I still can't explain exactly how I knew. Not in a way that would make sense to somebody outside emergency services, but after 11 years, you develop instincts. You can tell the difference between somebody doing the right things and somebody doing something that only looks right. Dale looked busy. His hands never stopped moving. Anybody watching from a distance would have thought he was doing exactly what he should, but he wasn't. The woman's airway wasn't positioned correctly. Not by accident, not because he was rushed. It was wrong, in a very specific way. I walked over and kept my voice calm, told him I'd take over. Said I needed him to grab the stretcher. Just a normal handoff, nothing dramatic. He looked up at me, and for about a second, his face changed. There was nothing there. No surprise, no frustration, no relief that someone else was stepping in. Nothing. Just blank, like somebody had switched him off. Then, just as quickly, the smile came back. He nodded, stood up, and went to get the stretcher. That was the first moment I stopped wondering whether something was wrong with Dale and started wondering, who he really was.
The woman survived. She spent 4 days in the hospital, and she made it.
I should have felt relieved. Instead, I couldn't stop thinking about Dale. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I went straight to the station, pulled his intake file, started reading it again from the beginning. Everything looked normal. Name, address, paperwork, and right there, his EMT certification number. Neat handwriting, official looking. I opened the Oklahoma State Department of Health's EMT registry, typed the number in. No record found. I checked it again, made sure I hadn't mistyped it. Still, nothing. Then I searched his name. Different spellings, different combinations. Nothing. Not one result that matched him. I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. A database problem, expired certification, paperwork that hadn't updated yet. Anything. For a while, I almost believed it. Then I opened our call logs, started going back through every medical call since Dale joined the station. There were 11. I wrote every one of them down. Patient, date, outcome, everything. 6 of the calls looked completely normal. Multiple responders, everybody working together, patients transported, patients recovered. Nothing unusual. The other 5 were different. More isolated. Patients already in serious condition when we arrived. Calls where Dale ended up as the primary responder, while the rest of us were tied up somewhere else. I kept reading, one report after another. Then I noticed the pattern. Out of those 5, 3 patients died. Officially, every one of them made sense. A cardiac arrest, a crash victim who never regained consciousness, an older man found at the bottom of his own porch steps. Every death had already been ruled accidental. Every report had been signed off. Every case was closed. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it really was. But by then, I couldn't make myself believe in coincidence anymore. Because every time Dale had been left alone with someone, something had gone wrong. And I couldn't stop wondering how many of those people might have survived if somebody else had reached them first. I know none of that proves anything. Not by itself. People die on medical calls. That's part of the job. Sometimes you do everything right, and it still isn't enough. So the numbers alone, they don't prove what I keep feeling they prove. But I couldn't let it go. I started making phone calls. Nothing official, nothing through the department, just quietly asking around. Small towns work that way. Somebody always knows somebody. I wanted to find anyone who'd actually seen Dale working with one of those 3 patients. Anybody who could tell me what happened during those last few minutes. I never found one. Every single time, Dale had been alone with the patient during the critical window. The rest of us had been tied up somewhere else, working another victim, managing traffic, fighting the fire, whatever the situation called for. At the time, it always made sense. There was always a reason. 3 weeks ago, I finally took everything to Captain Briggs. The certification number, the registry search, the pattern in the calls, everything. I was careful. I didn't accuse Dale of murder, didn't even say I knew something was wrong. I just laid out the facts and let Briggs draw his own conclusions. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't argue. When I finished, he looked uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable. He just nodded and said he'd look into it. That was it. Since that conversation, Dale hasn't responded to a single call. I don't know if Briggs quietly pulled him off the schedule or if Dale stepped away on his own. Nobody's said anything to me. Nobody's explained anything. Then last week, I drove past the house he'd been renting on Garfield Street. His truck was gone. I asked one of the neighbors if he'd seen Dale. He shrugged and said he thought the guy moved out over the weekend, just packed up and disappeared. I don't know where he went. I don't know who he really was. I don't know if that certification number belonged to somebody else, or if there really is a Dale Hutchins somewhere in Tulsa, completely unaware his identity might have been used. What I keep coming back to is this. If I'm right, even partly right, He spent 8 months working beside us. He answered 11 emergency calls. He was trusted with people's lives, not because anyone truly knew him, but because he showed up with paperwork, a good handshake, and a friendly smile. Nobody looked any deeper, because nobody had a reason to, until there was. And that's the part I still think about. Not just Dale. I think about all the other small volunteer stations across the country, the ones desperate for help, the ones happy to have anyone willing to answer the pager. I wonder how many captains would have welcomed him the same way we did. How many would have thanked him for volunteering? How many would have never questioned a single piece of paper he handed them? I think about that a lot more than I want to. Because if Dale really was who I think he was, I have a feeling we weren't the first station he joined, and I seriously doubt we'll be the last. My sister Lindsay used to tell me I worried too much, all the time, like it was some kind of personality flaw. The way people say you're too sensitive or too cautious. You worry too much, Dana. I heard that sentence so many times, I eventually started believing it. I stopped trusting my instincts, started telling myself every bad feeling was just anxiety, that I was imagining things. I don't make that mistake anymore. This happened about 2 summers ago, out in rural Tennessee. Lindsay had just gone through a brutal divorce. Her ex-husband, Brooks, emptied their joint bank account, then disappeared to Florida with a woman he'd met at a work conference. It sounds like something out of a bad TV movie, until it happens to someone you love. She needed to get away, so she rented a cabin outside Cookeville for a week, just the 2 of us. She called it a girls' trip. I called it a reset. Either way, I said yes. The cabin was beautiful, not fancy, just quiet. The kind of place that reminds you how loud normal life actually is. It sat at the end of a long gravel road, trees on 3 sides, a wide, shallow creek behind it. The nearest neighbor was about 1.5 miles away. The closest gas station was 11 minutes by car. We knew that because we timed it. The first 3 days were exactly what Lindsay needed. We cooked real meals, sat on the porch with wine every evening, watched the tree line disappear into the dark. We slept later than we had in years. My phone barely had a signal. I thought I'd hate that. Turns out, I loved it. For the first time in a long time, I stopped waiting for something bad to happen. That lasted until the 4th day. We drove into Cookeville for lunch and groceries. Nothing special, just a normal afternoon. On the way back, heading toward the cabin, we passed an older, dark green Ford F250 parked on the shoulder, Tennessee plates. I glanced over as we drove by. Didn't see anyone inside. Didn't think much about it. People pull over on roads like that all the time, checking property lines, hunting access, taking a phone call. It didn't seem unusual, not then. I didn't think about that truck again, at least not until I saw it for the 2nd time.
The next morning, the truck was still there. Same green Ford, same spot, same angle, like it hadn't moved all night. This time I looked a little harder as we drove past. The cab looked empty, at least I thought it did. The windows were dark enough that I couldn't be completely sure. I mentioned it to Lindsay. She barely looked up from her coffee, said it was probably a hunter's truck. Then she smiled and said, "There you go again. You worry too much." So I let it go. The rest of the afternoon was quiet. Lindsay took a nap. I sat on the porch with a book and watched a thunderstorm roll across the hills. It never actually reached us, just drifted past in the distance. By evening, we were both getting a little restless, so we drove about 15 minutes the other direction to a little bar and grill we'd noticed our first day. It was exactly the kind of place you'd expect out there. Dollar bills stapled to the ceiling, an old jukebox that only played country and classic rock, and honestly, the best fried catfish I've ever had. We stayed longer than we'd planned. By the time we left, it was almost midnight. The drive back was completely dark. No streetlights, just our headlights cutting through the trees. I drove.
Lindsay had a couple more beers than I did, so it made more sense. She fell asleep before we even turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, her head against the window, out cold. I figured I'd just wake her once we got there. No big deal. I pulled into the driveway, shut off the engine, and for a second, I just sat there. If you've ever stayed somewhere that remote, you know the silence. It almost feels heavy, like the whole world just stops moving. I got out, walked around to the passenger side, opened Lindsay's door to wake her up. That's when I noticed the headlights. Way down at the end of the gravel road, right where it met the main road, maybe 200 yards away, a vehicle was sitting there, not moving, just facing toward the cabin, its headlights pointed straight up the road. I stood there for a second trying to make sense of it. Maybe somebody was turning around. Maybe they'd pulled over to check directions. Maybe I helped Lindsay inside instead, got her settled on the couch with a blanket. She was half asleep and had no idea what I was looking at. Then I stepped back onto the porch. The headlights were still there. I watched them. 1 minute, 2 minutes, maybe 4. They never moved, never flickered, nothing. Then, without warning, they went out. Not like a car driving away, just dark. I couldn't hear an engine, couldn't hear tires on gravel. Nothing, just silence. I went back inside, locked every door, checked every window, then checked them again. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that Lindsay was right, that I worried too much. And somehow, I almost managed to believe it. Right up until the next morning. I want to be careful in describing what happened next. I've replayed that night in my head so many times. I don't want to remember any of it wrong. We were supposed to drive home on Sunday. This was Friday night. The next morning, I told Lindsay about the headlights. Told her I wanted to leave early. She didn't laugh at me. She wasn't dismissive. She was actually trying to help. She just smiled and said, "Dana, it's one more night. You love it here. Don't let your brain ruin this for you." I almost argued. I almost told her we were leaving anyway. But then I looked at her, thought about everything she'd been through with Brooks, the divorce, the money, everything. This trip was the first time I'd seen her genuinely happy in months. So I said, "Okay, one more night." We stayed close to the cabin all day, didn't go anywhere. We sat by the creek, cooked dinner on the little charcoal grill, talked for hours, laughed more than we had all week. Honestly, it was a really good day. By the time the sun went down, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. We went to bed before 10. I lay awake for a while listening to the creek, the tree frogs, the wind through the trees. Eventually, I drifted off. I still don't know what woke me. There wasn't a loud noise, no bang, no voice, nothing I can point to. It was just one of those moments where your body wakes up before your mind does, like some part of you has already decided something isn't right. I opened my eyes. The room was completely dark. I didn't move, just listened. The creek, the frogs, the same sounds I'd fallen asleep to. Then, underneath all of it, I heard something else, very faint, gravel, shifting. I got out of bed, didn't turn on a light, didn't wake Lindsay. I walked slowly to the bedroom window overlooking the front of the cabin and looked outside. There was someone standing in the driveway, about 30 feet from the front door, just standing there, facing the cabin. I couldn't see his face, it was too dark, but I could make out his shape. Tall, broad shoulders, dark clothes. He wasn't looking around, wasn't walking, wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, looking at the house. I realized I'd stopped breathing. My legs started shaking, but I couldn't make myself move. He stayed there for what felt like forever. Maybe it was a minute, maybe 5, I honestly don't know. Then, without any rush, he turned, walked slowly around the side of the cabin, and disappeared from view.
I kept staring at the corner where he'd vanished, waiting for him to come back. He never did, and somehow that scared me even more. I went straight to Lindsay's room. Before I woke her, I covered her mouth with my hand. I had no idea what she'd do if she woke up and saw a stranger outside. I couldn't risk her screaming. For a split second she panicked, then her eyes focused on me. I put a finger to my lips. She nodded, didn't make a sound. I whispered everything as fast as I could about the man, the driveway, the way he'd walked around the cabin. I watched her expression change, confused, then scared, then completely focused. I'd never seen that look on her face before, and I hope I never see it again. I told her we had to get to the car. Then I realized something. Her keys were on the kitchen counter. The kitchen was at the back of the cabin, the same side the man had disappeared around. We had two choices. Neither of them was good. After a few seconds, I made the decision. We'd go out the front. If he'd stayed behind the cabin, the front should be clear. The car was only about 30 feet away. If I was right, we'd be inside with the doors locked before he could get back around. If I was wrong, I didn't let myself finish that thought. I took the deepest breath of my life and opened the front door. The driveway was empty. We ran. Neither of us looked back. I threw the car into gear and accelerated so hard the rear tires started sliding on the loose gravel. The whole car fishtailed before I got it straight. When we reached the end of the driveway, our headlights swept across the shoulder of the main road. The green Ford F250 was still there. We didn't slow down, didn't look twice. I just kept driving, straight to Cookville. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station, parked under the canopy, locked the doors, and called 911. My hands were shaking so badly, I hit the wrong numbers twice before I finally got the call through. Sheriff deputies searched the property. They found fresh boot prints behind the cabin, along the creek bank. More than one set, which meant there had been more than one person back there. They also found a back window. The latch had been worked loose. Not fully open, just almost. Nothing inside the cabin had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. One of the deputies told us that probably meant we'd left before the second stage of whatever they were planning. They ran the plates on the truck. It had been reported stolen out of Nashville 3 weeks earlier. We never went back to that cabin. The rental company packed up our things and shipped them to us. I haven't been back to that part of Tennessee since, and I don't plan to. I still think about the timeline, more than I probably should. The first time we passed that truck, how completely ordinary it seemed. The headlights at the end of the road, how badly I wanted to explain them away. I think about Lindsay telling me not to let my brain ruin the trip, and I think about that loose window latch, about what would have been on the other side of it if we'd stayed. Lindsay has never told me I worry too much again, not once. Sometimes I think she's waiting for me to bring it up, maybe so we can both laugh about it, maybe so we can finally let it go, but I never do, because I honestly don't know what I'd say. Now, whenever somebody tells me I'm overthinking, I remember that weekend, because if we'd stayed in that cabin even one more hour, I honestly don't know if either of us would have made it home.